Good evening. Welcome to the 13th Morse Colloquium presented by the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. It's being held here at the historic Lilly Auditorium at the Marine Biological Laboratory in Woods Hole and being live streamed to an online audience. My name is Mark Hahn. I'm a senior scientist at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. My colleagues and I at the Oceanographic Institution are organizing this colloquium as part of our Marine Microplastics Research Initiative. As also part of this initiative, we've organized an international workshop that will be held over the next 3 days, involving more than 100 scientists involved in research on microplastics in the ocean. The goal of the workshop is to assess the current state of knowledge about microplastics in the ocean, including the major gaps in our understanding of the nature and scope of the problem, and to outline a research agenda for the future. This evening's public colloquium is the opening event of the workshop, providing an opportunity for the local community and an online audience to hear from and pose questions to some of the world's leading researchers on this topic. I mentioned that this is the 13th Morse Colloquium. The Morse Colloquia were established with a generous gift from the late Elizabeth W. and Henry A. Morse, Jr. Their vision was to provide an opportunity for scientists to engage with the public on societal issues of global importance. I never had the pleasure of meeting Harry and Betty, but I've spoken to people who knew them well. Harry and Betty cared deeply about education and supported many students during their lifetimes, so they would be thrilled to see the young people in the audience this evening. Harry and Betty also thought that scientists should spend more time outside of their laboratories, engaging with the public and addressing issues of concern to society. We agree, and that's why we're holding this event this evening. Previous Morse Colloquia have focused on issues such as the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, the impacts of Hurricane Katrina, the impact of the Fukushima disaster in Japan, and climate change, among many others. The topic of this year's colloquium, microplastics in the ocean, is one that has emerged, especially in the past several years, as one of great concern worldwide. The goal of the colloquium is to provide objective information about the issue and foster a discussion about current research on microplastics in the ocean and how it can help us to better understand the scope of the problem and find possible solutions. We're pleased to see the great turnout here for this event. The audience includes a variety of community members, representatives of local conservation organizations, and a group of ocean science journalism fellows visiting the Oceanographic Institution this week. We also have several groups of middle and high school students involved in efforts to reduce plastic waste, including a group from Martha's Vineyard who came over on the ferry. Most of the scientists attending the microplastics workshop that begins tomorrow are also here in attendance. Thank you all for your participation in this event. This evening's event will begin with a keynote presentation by Dr. Lavender of the Sea Education Association. This will be followed by introductions by our panelists. Then Kara will join the panel on stage for a question and answer session moderated by Dr. Heather Goldstone, the host of Living Lab Radio on our local national public radio stations, WCAI and WGBH. The event will end with an open reception for the panelists and the audience down at the Redfield Laboratory at the Oceanographic across the drawbridge down Water Street. I want to thank Andrew Daly, Kate McMullen, and the Woods Hole Oceanographics Communications Group for all their help in organizing this workshop. I'd also like to thank Matt Barton, Ken Costell, and Richard Boudreau for setting up the live stream. I'd now like to invite up Dr. Richard Murray to offer his welcome on behalf of the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution and to introduce our keynote speaker. Rick is a marine geochemist who previously served as a professor of Earth and Environment at Boston University, as a trustee of the Sea Education Association in Woods Hole, and as the director of the Division of Ocean Sciences of the U.S. National Science Foundation. Rick joined the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution in September of this year as our new Deputy Director and Vice President for Research. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rick Murray.
Thank you, Mark, and welcome everybody. This is a great event tonight, something I've been looking forward to since it got on my calendar earlier this year. And it's also serving as a terrific kickoff for the workshop that starts tomorrow, as Mark said. So I too would like to welcome everybody here to Woods Hole and thank you for taking the time to participate this evening. It really speaks to the convening power of the oceanographic community in this small town overall, right? And that so many of you have traveled also shows how important the subject of marine plastics itself has become. On my part, I'm also pleased to introduce Dr. Kara Lavender, whom I've had the pleasure to know and work with in various ways over the last 15 or almost 20 years. Her biography in your packet does an excellent job summarizing her ample accomplishments both scientifically as well as in the terms of shepherding the national and international communities in bringing scientific rigor to the marine plastic community. I'm not going to reiterate her bio here for you, but there are two things that I would like to add to it, flesh it out a little bit. First, when you drill down into other aspects of her bio or other versions of her bio that are online, you can find wording such as the following. Dr. Lavender Law's research interests include large-scale and mesoscale ocean circulation, intermediate and deep water formation in the North Atlantic and its role in meridional overturning circulation, the distribution of plastic marine debris driven by ocean physics, and the degradation and ultimate fate of plastics in the ocean. Now that second part about plastics, given that you're here and so on, you're probably familiar with. But I wanted to bring your attention in particular to the first part about large-scale and mesoscale ocean circulation and so on. I highlight this because those aspects of Kara's expertise, namely that of a highly quantitative and objective ocean scientist, is precisely, in my opinion, why she's been able to advance the field of marine plastics so effectively. Secondly, and on a more personal note, I'd be remiss not to explicitly note that Kara is an uncommonly talented and dedicated educator. Some of this is in the context of her outstanding work with SEA, also here in Woods Hole, where she's currently a research professor of oceanography in addition to being a guest investigator at WHOI. I've had the privilege of working with her, including the two of us sharing chief scientist responsibilities on an SEA cruise in the Caribbean. I highly recommend. We were sailing between Thanksgiving and Christmas in the Caribbean. It was a great, great gig. They actually were paying us for it. And anyway, thus I've truly witnessed her skills firsthand. And, you know, she's educating all of us too, right? That's why we're all here. And that's the hallmark of an excellent scientist, one who not only pursues either applied or basic research, but who's educating students, other scientists, stakeholders such as policymakers, and so on. It's an all-out effort, and she is appropriately widely recognized for her successes in these regards. We're very fortunate to have her here with us tonight. So enough from me. Over to you, Kara, and welcome to the Morse Colloquium.
Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you, Rick, for that overly generous introduction. It's really my honor to be here as the first speaker of what's sure to be a really exciting week here at the Woods Hole Oceanographic as we talk about the science of microplastics in the ocean. Am I supposed to start my own PowerPoint? That is the first question. Oh, great. Thank you. Okay, now we're ready. So it is my great pleasure, and I'm also very honored to be sharing the table up here with some incredible colleagues and fellow scientists for the rest of this evening. So I really do hope that you all pick their brains because they have an incredible wealth of knowledge. So I'm going to start off a little bit broadly. You probably all know this already, but the Earth is more than 70% covered by ocean. And the oceans hold about 97% of the planet's water, so their health is critically important to our existence. In addition to providing a very important food supply, the oceans also provide more than 50% of the oxygen that we breathe. And ocean currents are responsible for the heat transport that helps regulate our climate. And that's a little pointer to my earlier career that Rick mentioned. Yet when I meet students who are studying marine science or students from all variety of majors that come to study at Sea Education Association in our Sea Semester program, by far the most common answer to the question, why are you interested in studying the ocean, is because I love the ocean. So I think many of us have formed an emotional connection to the ocean through maybe spending childhood summers on the beach, or maybe having gone on an exciting scuba diving vacation, or simply living in a fishing community or a coastal community. And for folks that aren't fortunate enough to live so close to the coast, this connection can be formed by visiting an aquarium or even just seeing photos of white sand beaches or remote Antarctic shores or colorful and diverse coral reefs. So we're very fortunate to have these very positive experiences with the ocean. And I think that really leads to the shock and disgust that people have when they learn that beaches far, far from human populations are littered with trash, or that already threatened corals have been ingesting small pieces of plastic, or that marine animals, marine wildlife are being entangled in lost or abandoned fishing gear. So people love the ocean, people care about the ocean, and rightfully people are concerned about trash in the ocean. But it's really important to remember that for many of the 40% of the human population that lives within 100 kilometers of the coast, it's a very different picture. So for folks who live in places like this, their health and their livelihood and their well-being are intimately tied to this environment, which is certainly not healthy. So it seems obvious that we should be concerned about trash in the environment, but one question I want to raise is why now? Why have we seen this tremendous increase in attention on ocean plastics in the past few years? So let's look at a little bit of a historical perspective. This is a figure from a paper led by Roland Geyer at the University of California, Santa Barbara, estimating the total amount of plastics ever produced by humans since the start of commercial production, which is nominally 1950. So you see this blue line is the global plastics production in units of million metric tons. And what you see is a rapidly increasing, almost exponential increase over time. In fact, the growth in plastics production has outpaced the growth of all other man-made materials, including cement and aluminum and steel. And the amount of plastics produced since 2000, the amount has nearly doubled since 2000. So we estimated in this work that 8.3 billion metric tons of plastics have been produced over this time period. And that number is so enormous that we can't talk about it in terms of elephants or Empire State Buildings or football stadiums. It's a huge number. Now you see that there's also a red line on this figure. This is plotting the estimated plastic waste generation. So we've estimated in this work that 70% of the plastics ever produced have become waste. And of that waste, only 9% has been recycled and only 12% has been incinerated. So what this means is that thinking about the plastics that are currently in use today, as well as those that have been disposed of in landfills or perhaps lost to the environment, we estimate that about 90% of those materials are still in existence. Okay, well, you may not know that actually the first documented instance of wildlife being contaminated by plastic debris was published in a paper in 1969 of a seabird having ingested plastics, which you can't really see in that photo, that was documented in 1966. This is at a time when global plastics production was only 5% of the amount that's produced today. Just a few years later, scientists here at the Woods Hole Oceanographic documented floating bits of plastic in the North Atlantic Ocean. And another year or two after that, similar plastic bits were documented in the Pacific Ocean. And in fact, at Sea Education Association, where we've been operating here since 1971, our students and scientists anecdotally started seeing these little bits of plastic coming up in plankton nets in the late 1970s. And scientist Jude Wilbur, who's still local here, published an article in Oceanus magazine in 1987 describing that early data set. Well, if we go forward now to 2003, this was a time when Charles Moore, who's an avid sailor and environmentalist, wrote an article in Natural History magazine describing his view from the deck of a ship crossing the North Pacific. And his description of that view was, as far as the eye could see, the sight of plastic. In fact, it was in this article in Natural History magazine that the garbage patch was born. Now, although plastics production had been on a growth trajectory since pretty much its start in the 1950s, and scientists had documented this contamination for decades prior to that, we weren't really talking a whole lot about ocean plastics until the arrival of the garbage patch. Well, soon after its birth, the garbage patch really developed into a phenomenon. You heard things like twice the size of Texas, that grew to 3 times the size of France, more plastic than plankton, so much trash that it's a floating landfill you could walk on. You could even see it from space. So although these images are very striking and immensely memorable in their portrayal, it's really important to know that there is no such thing as a floating island you can see from space. So if you came in here with that idea, please wipe that from your brain, and we're going to talk about what it actually looks like out in these areas of the ocean called garbage patches. So at Sea Semester, we bring students from across the country and increasingly internationally to come study with us for 6 weeks on our campus a couple miles up the road, and then out to sea on our tall sailing ships that operate in the Atlantic and in the Pacific. And as I mentioned, our students and scientists had started observing plastics in our plankton nets long ago. And what I want to do is show you what it looks like from the deck of these ships in the areas where debris accumulates. So these garbage patches, or the subtropical ocean, from the deck of a ship typically look like this. Sort of calm seas, you see sky and clouds and water, and occasionally something really surprising will drift by. So on the left here, we have a boot that's floating upside down. On the right is a 5-gallon bucket. And this is really shocking to see something that clearly does not belong in the middle of the ocean, hundreds or thousands of miles from land. You think, well, maybe that was just an accidental loss. More often, you might find objects that you can't really identify. So these might be fishing buoys that have drifted away. On the right, this kind of looks like a container. The most common type of material that you'll see just looking over the side of the ship are sort of fragments and big chunks of plastic. Maybe you have no idea what they are, but they're pretty clearly plastic just by the way that they look. But again, no large mass, no large collection, no floating landfill. But your perception really changes just by towing a plankton net off the side of the ship for 30 minutes and then sifting through its contents. And this is what our thousands of Sea Semester students have been doing for decades, twice a day, every day. When you look at the contents of the collecting jar from a Newstone net tow, from a plankton net tow, what you see looks like this: microplastics, the subject of our entire week here. Well, what exactly are microplastics? So when I'm asked that question, I say, well, the highly technical definition is small bits of plastic. There is no exact or precise scientific definition at this point, and I'm going to tell you some of the reasons I think why. Well, historically, some of the first definitions were really around the size of the particle, and this kind of reflects the historical knowledge about floating plastics, which largely came from these plankton nets, which, by the way, were deployed not to collect plastic, but to collect plankton. Mm-hmm. So plankton nets commonly have a mesh size of about 1/3 of a millimeter. So we're collecting particles larger than 1/3 of a millimeter, and the first definition said, well, microplastics are smaller than 5 millimeters. So here's your little scale here. So it's a little bit smaller than the B. That's the left-hand red bar. So microplastics initially were particles defined as particles smaller than 5 millimeters, operationally defined by the size of particles collected by plankton nets. Well, over time, we've been collecting and measuring these particles in new and different ways, including filtering water samples, whole water samples, onto filters that have gotten increasingly smaller. And what we find is that the smaller the filter, the smaller the particles that you find, all the way down potentially to nanoscales. So microplastics today still are largely defined by their size, but everybody's definition is different. So it's really important when you're reading a scientific study to understand what was being measured and how that was being defined. Where do microplastics come from? some microplastics are actually manufactured in that size. So if you think about the plastic microbeads that were formerly included in wash-off cosmetics in this country, those are intentionally perhaps manufactured in that size. And on the bottom left of this figure, you can see some industrial resin pellets. So that's sort of the raw material of many common consumer products that are made of plastics. But most microplastics are fragments of larger items. So when plastics are exposed, in particular to the UV radiation and sunlight, the material weakens. And then if it gets sheared or jostled, those little bits of particles can break apart into smaller and smaller pieces. So we know that you can generally tell by looking at them that they broke apart from larger objects, but we can't determine the source. We can't determine what kind of object that was, whether this particle came from a milk crate or a milk jug, or whether it came from a foam cup or a foam buoy. And we can't tell from any chemical ID at this point where it came from geographically. So that little bit of plastic that we collected in the North Atlantic could have come from New York or Miami or Boston or London or Africa. We don't know. Also in this photo, you can see there's a wide variety of shapes of these particles. And there are several categories that describe sort of commonly described forms. So we have fragments, which are typically these irregularly shaped bits of bigger things, pellets. You can see in this case, these are actually what we call line at SCA, which is probably from monofilament line, but people are increasingly finding microfibers from textiles and microbeads. So we have some categories to describe shape. Of course, microplastics can be made of a wide variety of polymers, and these are the most common polymers because a lot of our products and packaging are made from them. You may be familiar with these resin identification codes, but there are a wide variety, many more polymers than listed here that these particles are made of. Now, it's important to know that even if two different particles are made up of, say, number 2, high-density polyethylene, if one came from a clear milk jug and one came from a colored detergent bottle, those are still chemically different, even though they have the same polymer backbone. And that's because of the chemical additives included in these products. So chemical additives are typically proprietary formulations that give products their color or give products some other characteristics such as flexibility or resistance to UV degradation. So to sum up, what are microplastics? Microplastics are a diverse and complex category of contaminants. And to make it worse, or to make it a little bit more complicated, the characteristics of these microplastics evolve when they're exposed in the environment. So they can become smaller, they can change their shape, and their chemical composition can also change. So microplastics are the most numerically abundant and the most widespread form of plastic debris in the marine environment. We find them on beaches and coastlines. They're floating at the sea surface, and we found them deeper in the water column. They've been found buried in deep sea sediments in a variety of places. And microplastics have even been found frozen into Arctic sea ice. But microplastics are not only in the marine environment. The more we look, the more we find. They've also been found now in freshwater environments, including lakes, streams, and rivers. They're in the terrestrial environment, in agricultural and other types of soils. They're in the air, they're in our drinking water, they're in bottled water, sea salt, beer, you name it. It does seem that the smaller the particle, the more abundant and widespread it is. So in the case of microfibers, those little pieces from textiles, we seem to find those more broadly spread and in higher concentrations, and perhaps that's because they are more easily transported not only by water, but also by air. It's important to note, though, that even though microplastics are abundant and widespread, that doesn't mean that they are uniformly distributed. So I want to talk you through a couple of examples, data showing you the distribution of microplastics. So the first, I'm going to draw upon the data set collected by SEA sea semester students over decades. So this is a map showing you the western North Atlantic Ocean, where each dot shows you the location of a plankton net toe, and a little reminder at the top that the plankton net collects particles from 1/3 of a millimeter and larger. Typically, the sizes are less than 10 millimeters of the particles that we collect. And the symbol is colored by the concentration of plastics measured in that net. So the warmer colors are the higher concentrations, and the stars are the highest concentrations in the black. So one thing you'll notice is that the highest concentrations are concentrated between 20 degrees north and 40 degrees north. There's this latitudinal band where we find the highest concentrations of microplastics. This is the garbage patch. The garbage patch is a place where ocean currents, ocean physics, acts to collect floating material. This is a convergence. You can think of it as sort of the dead end of the ocean currents. And you can see that outside of that latitude band, the concentrations are far lower. They're not zero. There are some high concentrations outside of that subtropical convergence zone, but by and large, the concentrations are lower. Now, if we look at SCA's data set in the Eastern Pacific Ocean, it's a similar map. You see North America, the sort of concentration around 20 north is Hawaii, and we go all the way down to Tahiti at 20 degrees south. So the latitudinal span here is much greater than the figure on the left in the North Atlantic. The color scheme is slightly different, but same idea with the warm colors are the highest concentrations. So when you look at this map, you see that, again, the highest concentrations are located mainly between about 20 degrees north and 40 degrees north, because that same ocean physics at play in the North Atlantic is at play in the North Pacific. But I like this figure because when you expand this range all the way down to the southern hemisphere, you can really clearly see that there's not a whole lot of plastic down in the tropics. And the reason, again, is ocean physics. In the tropics, we have a divergence zone where the ocean currents are pulling material away from the equator. So in general, plastics of this size, their distribution, sort of if you squint your eyes, can largely be described by this wind-driven ocean circulation. But it's important to note that even in the garbage patches, the high accumulation zones, we have a lot of variability. Now I have to find the pointer. I may not be able to point. Okay. So if you look at the word pieces on the left, there's a black star, and just above that, there's a blue dot, and next to it, a yellow dot. So even on the same cruise track, those are samples taken about 4 hours apart, 25 kilometers apart. We see orders of magnitudes differences in the amount of plastics that were collected in the plankton net. And even in these garbage patches, these high accumulation zones, there are plankton nettos that collected 0 plastics. So this is just important to note that even though we may be able to explain large-scale patterns, there are lots of differences when you get down to small scales. All right, well, keep in mind this pattern as we go to another example of plastics, microplastics concentration plotted on now a global map. So this is a data set collected by citizen scientists in the Global Microplastics Initiative of the group called Adventure Scientists. Now, in this case, volunteers from around the globe collected 1 liter water samples from both marine and freshwater environments. And then this amazing woman, Abby Barrows, who is sitting in the audience, analyzed each and every one of these water samples, now filtering those samples through a filter that's 0.45 microns in size. Now, just to give you some context, that plankton net from the previous slide, the smallest particle collected in the plankton net is about 750 times larger than the smallest particle that could be collected on this filter. So we're really collecting and plotting different types of particles. But in this map, you can see there still is very widespread distribution of microplastics. The orange have microplastics. There are places that had 0. And again, when you look at the oranges, you can see that the concentrations vary. So some of those dots had only 1 piece of plastic or 2 pieces per liter, and the largest had more than 500. So there's a couple messages I want you to take home from looking at those 2 maps. First, a microplastic is not a microplastic is not a microplastic. Depending on what we're measuring, the size, how we're characterizing these things, you may get a very different picture. The distribution in this map is quite different from the distribution in the map before. And the second thing I wanted you to take home from this, I've forgotten, so I'm going to look at it. Oh, yes. So microplastics are globally distributed. They're widespread, they're abundant, but they're not the same everywhere. Not every single place is going to be contaminated. Okay, I want to turn now to the impacts of plastic debris. So up here is a photograph of an albatross chick from Midway Atoll, and taken by Chris Jordan. And I like to think of this as sort of the poster child of the modern ocean plastics era, because most people have probably seen this and been extremely disturbed by the cigarette lighter and the bottle cap and other bits of plastics that were found in this chick, which is not unusual from his photographs in this colony. So plastics ingestion certainly is widespread. It's now been documented in more than 220 marine species. And of course, what's ingested depends on the size of the animal. So whales have been found with flower pots and car parts in their guts, sea turtles with plastic bags, seabirds obviously with identifiable objects. But when we start getting down to microplastics, really ingestion is available to many, many more animals, including fish. So this is a fish that we collected on one of our trips that had 42 pieces of microplastic in its stomach. And fish, this includes the species that we eat as seafood. Microplastics are ingested by invertebrates, such as the gooseneck barnacle, and can even be ingested by organisms at or near the base of the food web, including zooplankton. So we know that animals that ingest plastic debris can be physically damaged by the debris. It can perforate their gut, it can cause clogging in their intestines, it can fill up their stomachs so that perhaps they're feeling satiated without really getting any nutrition. And there are certainly examples of animals that have been injured and suffered or died due to plastics ingestion. There are also species where we know there's a high frequency of occurrence of plastics ingestion. So for example, the northern fulmars in the North Sea, in 95% of specimens analyzed, plastics were found in the guts of those animals. But what we don't know, even in the case of the northern fulmars, is what the impact on the population is. Is this causing a reduction in population size? This is a big open question. The impacts of ingesting plastic debris are further complicated by the chemicals associated with that debris. So chemicals, plastic debris can have chemicals that were either added during manufacture or byproducts of manufacture. And plastics also are really good sponges in the natural environment, in seawater, for contaminants that are legacy contaminants that have been there for decades, things like DDTs and PCBs. So we know from environmental samples, and Dr. Takata could speak to this in more detail on the panel, we know that particles in the ocean have much higher concentrations of some of these sorbed chemicals than the surrounding seawater. And there have been laboratory experiments testing whether or not these chemicals, whether the chemicals on these plastic pieces, when they're eaten by wildlife, transfer into animal tissue. Because of course, that's the concern. We know that there are harmful effects that can be caused by many of these chemicals. So there are laboratory experiments that have shown those chemicals can transfer into animal tissue. Some of those experiments have shown that animals are harmed. But it's important to note that there are also experiments that show no effect from eating microplastics ingestion. And Dr. Rockman will be able to speak more to that from her work. So this leads to a really important question about what we know and what we don't know about ingestion of microplastics specifically, or just plastics debris. Most of what's published in the literature are documents of wildlife being contaminated by plastic debris. And by contaminated, I mean that they're encountering debris, maybe through entanglement, maybe through ingestion, or maybe interacting in other ways. And in some cases, that contamination has very clear negative impacts on the animal. So this is an example of a sea lion that was rescued by the Marine Mammal Center in California that had a packing strap around its neck. And you can pretty clearly see this animal was injured and suffering. This is actually a positive story because the animal was rehabilitated and released back into the wild. So there are some cases where we can see a very clear impact. But especially when we talk about microplastics ingestion, the jury is still out. And there are a few reasons for this. Most of the work has been done in laboratories, and you cannot, even if you find a clear, strong negative impact on an animal in the laboratory, you can't necessarily extrapolate that result to the natural environment. This is further complicated by the fact that we don't actually know what animals in the natural environment are exposed to, so it's hard to do these kinds of assessments. Well, now if we start thinking about the animal that ate the microplastic and maybe the animal that they ate that animal ending up with the sushi on our dinner plates, we really can't say with any confidence what the impact might be on those organisms in the food web, or ultimately on those of us who choose to eat seafood, which I do. So this is really a major question. Okay, so despite the fact that we've had a tremendous increase in scientific research into ocean plastics and environmental plastics pollution over the past 5 or 10 years, there still remain very many major knowledge gaps, and I just want to step through a few of those. So one major question is how much plastic debris enters the ocean? Well, there was a study led by Jenna Jambeck at University of Georgia where we estimated the amount of plastic waste generated on land by you and I, people around the world, how much of that enters the ocean each year. And the result was a staggering 8 million metric tons. That's equivalent to one New York City garbage truck dumping a load of plastic into the ocean every minute. But what we don't know is how that debris is getting into the ocean. Is most of it carried in rivers, or is it being washed offshore on beaches? How much of that is being carried by wind? We don't have estimates for the amount of debris entering the ocean from natural disasters or from lost fishing and aquaculture gear. And we're starting to get a little bit of a handle on inputs of microplastics directly into the environment from things like wastewater or stormwater. And we're only now starting to think about transport by air, by wind, by the atmosphere. Where in the marine environment is it? When we look at the data collected within the marine environment, we can only account for about 1% of that 8 million metric tons. So this is a very open question, whether this debris that's entering the ocean is largely floating at the sea surface or on the sea floor. Is it on coastlines and shorelines? Is it how much is swimming around or flying around in marine wildlife? What are its characteristics? So especially for microplastics, what kinds of chemistries are we dealing with? What are the sizes? What are the shapes? This is really important for those questions about impacts on marine wildlife. We need to know very carefully what the characteristics of the debris are to understand the impacts on animals. But this is also important when we start to think about how the plastics are changing in the marine environment, how they're transforming, and what their ultimate fate is. Do plastics simply keep breaking down into infinitely smaller pieces, or are there points at which the microplastics might be photodegraded? Dr. Ward will talk about this a little bit. Or are there points where microbes might be able to biodegrade those plastics? Or are we just stuck with it eventually all sinking down to the seafloor? I've already mentioned the questions about what are its impacts on marine wildlife and the marine ecosystem. I think that's where a lot of people really have a lot of strong interest. That's where a lot of questions that remain unanswered. And then the ultimate question, of course, is human health, are we at risk from our exposure to microplastic through seafood or through all of those other means that I described earlier? Okay, well, despite these major gaps in understanding, it's widely argued that the scientific information available today is sufficient to justify action to prevent more plastic from entering the marine environment. And in fact, we are seeing increasing efforts on all levels, from international levels, the G7, the G20, the EU, and the UN, to national levels. Just in the US, we have a couple pieces of legislation intended to tackle aspects of this problem, down to local levels. And those of you who are local to Falmouth might recognize the Trash Shouldn't Splash, Skip the Straw, Refill, Reuse Falmouth efforts and the Falmouth Litter Reduction Team. There are also efforts by multi-stakeholder groups such as the Trash Free Seas Alliance, which includes industry members, NGOs, and government agencies, and from industry groups, the Alliance to End Plastic Waste. And we're going to need to take action at all of these levels with all of these actors to remediate and prevent environmental plastics pollution. In my opinion, though, ultimately, the path to a plastics-free ocean must be laid upon the foundation of the best available science. And that's science not just from marine scientists or oceanographers like myself or marine ecologists, but also from materials scientists and toxicologists and environmental chemists and social scientists. Human ingenuity has brought us incredible advances in health and technology and transportation and in many other realms through the development of plastics. And we really cannot live without plastics. We shouldn't expect to live without plastics. But now it's time to draw upon both that human ingenuity and our human connection to the ocean to solve this environmental pollution problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Kara. That was really great. Thanks for that wonderful overview to kick off this colloquium. I'm sure there are a number of questions for Kara, but before we open up the floor to questions, we're going to introduce our international panel of experts and ask each of them to provide a very brief overview of their expertise and interest in this issue. And to do that, I'd like to introduce the moderator of this evening's question and answer period. Dr. Heather Goldstone is known to many of you as an award-winning science correspondent for our local national public radio stations, WCAI and WGBH, and the host of Living Lab Radio, a weekly radio news magazine connecting science and society. Heather earned her PhD in biological oceanography from the MIT Woods Hole Oceanographic Joint Graduate Program in Oceanography, and she spent several years as a researcher before turning her attention to journalism. So she's the perfect person to moderate this session. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Heather Goldstone.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Mark, for that introduction. It's really an honor to be here. As Mark said, when I got my PhD from Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, Mark was an advisor in the lab next door, and Kara is an old friend, so it is an honor to share the stage with her and address this important issue. And as a scientist turned journalist, I have to say I wholeheartedly share the Morse's idea that scientists should spend as much time as possible not only in their labs but also interacting with the public. And so it is my pleasure to be here to help enable that this evening. As you may be able to hear from my voice, I'm recovering from a cold, and I know there are multiple of you in the audience who have this or have had it recently. It's no fun. So in part to spare my voice, but in large part because the real fun of this evening is going to be your questions for our experts. I'm going to keep introductions for our panelists to a minimum. You have bios that you can read in your programs, but we're basically going to let them introduce themselves with about 2 or 3 minutes about their research before we open things up to question and answers. I want to say really quickly before I introduce our first panelist that if you are on social media, awesome. The hashtag for tonight is Morse Microplastics, and don't forget that Morse has 2 S's and no E. So we look forward to seeing you on social media, tweeting and posting about Morse Microplastics. Our first panelist who's going to introduce her work is Dr. Chelsea Rockman. She is an assistant professor of ecology and evolutionary biology at the University of Toronto. And as Mark said, this is befitting a global problem, a very international panel. So representing Canada first.
So I guess I shouldn't tell anyone I'm from the United States. I'm proud to be Canadian tonight. All right. Okay, well, I will just introduce quickly myself and my group. So I run a research program at the University of Toronto, as was said, researching essentially anthropogenic stressors and how they impact ecosystems. But I have spent the last decade studying plastics. So I'm more of a plastics researcher than an anthropogenic stressors, but we're starting to foray into other things like road salt. I'm also a co-founder and director of a community engagement group that we call the U of T Trash Team. Our mission is to increase waste literacy in the local community in order to inform what you're learning about is a global problem. But I'll focus tonight on my research program, and in this research group, we work on several questions. Some of them include quantifying and characterizing microplastics in the environment. We do this in order to understand sources, figuring out where they come from. We do it to explore pathways, understanding how much is in stormwater, what is in wastewater, how it gets to the environment, as well as fate. We look at what's in the sediment, what's on the surface, but what's near and dear to my heart is what's in organisms. We try to understand how much is ingested, and if it is ingested, do the chemicals transfer to the tissue? Do the plastics themselves transfer to the tissue? If they do they bioaccumulate? We don't really know this yet. And if they transfer up the food web, do we actually see bioaccumulation and magnification like other contaminants, or do we simply see trophic dilution? Now, to answer some of these questions, it takes new methods and new tools. And so in our lab, we use microscopy, we use FTIR, ramen spectroscopy, which is not ramen noodles. They're a very expensive version of noodles. That's what my parents say. And then also pyrolysis GCMS. And the methods, as others will say as they come up here, is a challenge to this issue. As Kara mentioned, the smaller we look, the more we find, but it's not easy to find and quantify and characterize the smaller stuff. So while I am not a method development person, I spend a lot of time developing methods, including helping California inform their new standard method that they will have to have under a new bill for drinking water. So I'm part of a method evaluation study there, along with some other people in this room. But most near and dear to my heart is understanding ecological effects, as Kara mentioned. I consider myself an experimentalist, and in our lab, we do many different experiments across different scales to understand how microplastics impact organisms, and ecosystems at all levels of biological organization. So we sometimes work in 96 well plates to try to do high throughput experiments to understand how microplastics and other stressors like climate change impact individual organisms. To understand how microplastics impact populations of fish, we do experiments in laboratory tanks. To look at communities, we look in mesocosms. And my favorite project that I'm working right now is gearing up to try to do a whole ecosystem experiment at the Experimental Lakes area, which is something that is unique to Northwestern Ontario in Canada. And then we also sometimes do natural experiments in nature, quantifying what's there and trying to correlate it with impacts. And with that, I will allow for the next person and go ahead and have a seat. And I look forward to interacting.
That was a lot in 3 minutes. We're definitely going to get into more of that. That was a fabulous overview and introduction. Thank you. Up next, we have Dr. Gunnar Gertz. He is a senior scientist, and I'm definitely going to have to read this one, at the Alfred Wegener Institute Helmholtz Center for Polar and Marine Research.
I'm not so familiar with the Macintosh. Where is the... Ah, okay. Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to the Morse Colloquium. It's really a big pleasure for me. So we were asked to provide 2 slides for that colloquium here. I provided 3, okay, get 1, but not so densely packed. And we were also asked to provide some ideas for the discussion and some hot topics in the field of microplastic. And I think before I will come to that, I will have to explain why I am working on microplastics. I'm trained as a microbiologist. In fact, I was interested in the biofilm on microplastic. I was absolutely not concerned when I started to work on microplastics. I had no idea whether this is an emergency or whatever. I was really driven by curiosity. But at the end, it turned out that I had a brief idea to analyze the biofilms of what was growing on these items, but I had not the slightest idea what the item is at all. And so we started to analyze the item, and I came into contact with the community doing microplastics research and so on, and it turned out that there was a lot of, I would say, misinterpretation, a lot of expert knowledge, a lot of gut feelings and so on. And I was really concerned because there were really no facts. And if we think that this is an issue of concern, and if we agree with Paracelsus that the dose makes the poison, then we have to have an idea of the dose. That means we have to identify the items. And I mean, Para showed these nice, shiny red and blue issues, which you can really identify by eye. But if you look, this is the residues of 30 cubic meters of seawater macerated. And so please, in the audience, tell me what is microplastics there? Well, I made it very easy because this is the microplastics. You will never really identify the microplastics. And the issue is really, if the microplastic is getting small and smaller, there's no way to identify microplastics by eye. But again, we have to identify and analyze it, so we need reliable and definite standardized MP analytics. for giving reliable facts, and this is where I am working now for 8 years. So why do we need these facts for that? Because the question is, do they hurt? And this is what Kara also mentioned. And what makes me really concerned about, are we producing facts or artifacts in that way? Because, and that was also mentioned, that most of the effects were produced by, or produced what came from experimental work. And compared to the environmental concentrations, far higher concentrations were used in these experimental approaches, and I mean really far higher. And by the way, what is they, by the way? So, I mean, microplastics is not microplastics. So the question is, which type of microplastics is maybe the problem? Which shape, which polymer type, which MP size, which MPH, peacetime versus weather, or is the biofilm important, or the loading with chemicals or whatever? So this is a really, I mean, it's really a simple question, do they hurt? But the answer is not that easy to be given, because it's really complex. So you might think that scientists tend to give complicated answers to simple questions, but in that case, it's really the fact. And I think if we try to judge whether this is a hype or not, I think we really have to go for the facts. Okay, my last slide on that is maybe based on the issue that we were asked for a certain question in that link. So I was asked, what do you think are the 3 most important knowledge gaps affecting the design of effective solutions to microplastic pollution? And I really hate this question. Because I do not think that knowledge gaps are hindering us, because the general political, societal, and individual attitude. So, I mean, we should not solve this the problem from the back, but from the front, because it's very simple. Because we have to avoid the plastic pollution before and then after the child fell into the fountain. Before I had the shit. Okay. Because, and this is, I would like to cite a really good colleague from Holland, Heather Leslie. She coined the term young microplastics, and large plastic items in the environment are young microplastics. And if we do not want the microplastic in the environment, we should try not to get the large items into the marine environment, and that's all. Thank you.
Okay, so we've gotten a bit more detail on some of the difficulties with methodology and actually figuring out how much and what type of plastics are in the ocean that Kara mentioned. And so now we're going to get a little bit more on the question of impacts, and in particular, the chemicals that may come from or glom onto those plastics. And for that, we turn to Dr. Hideshige Takada from Tokyo University of Agriculture and Technology. And let me see here if I can get your slides up here for you.
Thank you so much for your kind introduction. And I'm very much honored to be here. I studied here almost 30 years ago with Dr. John Farrington and Dr. Mike Bosner and Mr. Bruce Tripp here. And I'm very happy to be here to present the research result here. And I have been studying the hazardous chemicals in microplastics and their role as source and carrier to marine organisms. and finally to human. And by using this slide, I would like to explain background of our studies. Plastic waste are fragmented into smaller pieces by UV radiation, as Kara already mentioned. And this is something like the sunburn with human. Our skin would get tattered due to sunburn. Similar would occur for plastics in surface water. Plastic would get smaller and smaller to be microplastics and finally to be nanoplastics. Depending on their sizes, plastics are ingested or uptaken by various sizes of marine organisms, such as whale or sea turtle or the seabirds here. Also some fishes, such as anchovy, also the bivalves, such as the mussels. Plastic products contain the various chemicals as additives, such as plasticizer here. Also the UV absorbers, also the flame retardant, and also antioxidant agents. And this is the UV absorbers, UV stabilizers are just an example. And the UV stabilizers are added to prevent the degradation of plastics. This is similar to that we put sunscreen to prevent the sunburn. UV stabilizers are just an example, and used plastic products contain various types, also various kinds of the additives in it. Some of the additives have the effect on the biological functions, such as the endocrine disruption. And some of the additives are leached out to seawater, but the others are still retained in microplastic in seawater. Furthermore, the bioaccumulative and toxic chemicals, such as PCBs and DDTs, are sold to the plastics due to their affinity to oil. Thus, microplastics are kind of the carrier of these kind of the hazardous chemicals to marine organisms. Through our field observations, also some laboratory experiments, we have been demonstrating that these chemicals are transferred from the ingested plastics and accumulated in the tissue of marine organisms. We got some evidences for seabirds. Our recent field observation suggested that bioaccumulation of some plastic additives in the tissue of the kind of beach organisms that eat hermit crab. This type of plastic-mediated chemical exposure is significant, mainly for additive chemicals in remote area. We need to conduct more field observations to understand the magnitude and spread of this phenomenon. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, we're getting there. We have a couple more panelists. Up next, we're coming back to the home team here. We have Dr. Colin Ward. He is an assistant scientist in the Department of Marine Chemistry and Geochemistry at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. Colin, you're not by any chance Canadian, are you?
So I study how sunlight breaks down organic carbon in lakes, rivers, and oceans. And I work on a wide range of organic carbon types, including Arctic natural organic matter that's draining permafrost soils, to man-made pollutants such as crude oil from the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, and plastics. I was asked to present what I think is one of the most pressing issues or questions. And to me, one of the most pressing questions related to this plastic pollution problem is understanding how long plastics last in the environment. And I want to briefly share with you a compilation of estimates for the environmental lifetime of common plastic goods that I retrieved with colleagues from various sources. So from international governmental agencies like the UN or NOAA Sea Grant, from nonprofit organizations that are interested in plastic pollution cleanup, as well as social media channels. In total, we had 42 informational graphics with 158 lifetimes. And these are reported for common use goods such as plastic straws, styrofoam cups, plastic bags, and plastic bottles. And there's three things I want you to take away from this graphic. The first is that the estimates that are reported out there that are being spread to the general public vary by orders of magnitude. In some cases, they vary from 1 year to forever on the far end, right? So let's take the case of the plastic bag. Woods Hole Sea Grant estimated that a plastic bag takes 1 year to degrade in the environment. In Nantucket, on their website, the government website there, it says a plastic bag takes 500 years to degrade. So 40 miles apart, but a 500-fold difference in the lifetime of this good. And this is a problem because this is the information coming down from our government that's being disseminated to the public. This is also a problem because the risks associated with something that lasts for 1 year in the environment versus the same thing that lasts for 500 years are completely different. The second thing I want you all to take away from this is that none of these lifetimes come from the peer-reviewed literature. It appears that most of these lifetimes are sourced from NOAA Sea Grant, Moat Marine Lab, and the U.S. National Park Service. And I did a lot of digging, spent a lot of time trying to find studies that were either funded by those institutions or agencies or actually conducted by them to see if they published peer-reviewed literature to report these estimates, and I couldn't find any. This is a problem because I think that peer-reviewed science should inform the information that we give to the public. The third thing is, unlike recycling of plastics by humans, we appear to be extremely efficient at recycling these non-peer-reviewed estimates. So let's look at the fishing line up here. We had 17 infographics that reported the lifetime of fishing line in the environment. Every single one said 600 years. And frankly, I'm being a little tongue-in-cheek here, but I think we're all more likely to win the Powerball than 17 independent scientific studies arriving at the same answer of 600 years for fishing line to degrade in the environment. So what's happening here is that these infographics are recycling the initial estimate that was reported by NOAA Sea Grant, which again is not peer-reviewed. So in summary, I think one of the most important questions that we need to answer is how long plastics last in the environment. The answer to this question, which should be rooted in peer-reviewed science, should be one factor that guides policy moving forward. And ultimately, we can provide accurate and revised infographics to the public. Thank you.
All right, last but not least, we've heard that science should inform policy. Our final panelist is Dr. Porter Hoagland. He is a senior research specialist at the Marine Policy Center right here at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution.
Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be on this distinguished panel. And I'd like to let you know, though, that my colleague, Hauke Kite-Powell, was supposed to be here. He's the real expert at the Marine Policy Center on microplastics. He was called away suddenly. He hopes to be back on Thursday for at least part of the workshop. And so I'm really starting from ground zero. It's a little bit like experiencing that nightmare where you show up at the final exam and somebody else has had this nightmare. And he forgot to study, and in my case, I actually forgot to go to class as well. For those of you who are students, I think I see students in the back, don't ever do this. All right. So what I'm going to try to do to save myself is to give you a little bit of a framework for approaching this problem. Some of my work in the past is related to other types of pollution and also to natural hazards like red tide. And we use the same kind of framework, and so I just want you to keep it in the back of your mind as we go forward. Just a few facts first. As Kara mentioned, plastics are not going away. It's hugely important to the world. The World Bank now estimates that the global economy is on the order of $80 trillion. That's trillion with 12 zeros. And plastics are about 1.5% of that, so more than $1 trillion. And so it's an enormous economy. Both the world economy and the plastic economy are growing about at the same rate, which kind of makes sense. It's between 2 and 3% a year. On the left, you can see sort of broken down the different types of plastics. I'm sure there's a much finer breakdown you could do, but packaging is a large part of that. And then on the right is just sort of shows you the growth, showing tons on the left and revenue on the right over time. So this is just to kind of drive home the point that it's not going away. Of course, as we consume more and more plastic, we want to become aware of instances where there are some types of what economists would call external costs. That is, things we're not keeping track of, public health effects on the environment, and so forth. So as we start to approach and think about the economic perspective of marine microplastics, one of the things that's really important to think about is the idea of opportunity cost. So what level of resources should we devote to reducing marine plastics in the ocean? And this requires understanding the cost to humans and the marine ecosystem. And I'll show you this general framework in a second. And it also requires understanding how those costs change with alternative solutions. We also will be worried about efficiency. What's the most efficient way to achieve an economically sensible reduction? And Hauke is particularly interested in these things, the role of recycling, the idea of a circular economy, which I think will be discussed probably during the workshop and especially on Friday, the idea of chemical recycling and so forth. What are the roles of alternatives, including bioplastics, paper straws and bags, etc. And so finally, I just want you to sort of look at this general framework that we typically use. And so this graph really represents a level of policy response. You can think of that as kind of the solution to the problem. There might be multiple solutions. In fact, of all 500 people in this room, you might probably each have a solution to the problem. But we can think of it as a particular solution or a combination of solutions. And along the y-axis, we just have costs. And the way we think about this is that as we increase the level of policy response, the damages in economic terms start to decrease. And that's that curve that's going down from where it says costs and going down. And but it typically will never reach zero. So we can't clean up all of the problem. But it can go down with some appropriate solution. At the same time, the costs of applying those solutions increase. And so when we think about this problem, there are two types of costs. There's the damages and also the cost of responding. And it's the total cost that we want to pay attention to. And in this particular case, in the middle is what we would call the optimal policy response. That's where the total costs are minimized. And so I just want you to keep this sort of general framework in mind as we proceed tonight and if you're going to the workshop over the next few days. Thank you.
Porter, you may be new to the microplastics arena, but I think you kind of got right to the heart of the matter, which is that we need factual information to figure out what the damages are, what the costs are, and what the effective possible solutions are. So, before we dive into our Q&A session, just a little bit of housekeeping. I do have a few questions for the panelists, and then we have 2 microphones that will be circulating around the room for you guys to ask questions of the panelists. Please do wait for a microphone to come to you, not only so that everyone in this room can hear you, but especially so that everyone watching online can hear you. And to those of you watching online, you also have the ability to ask questions. I will be getting those funneled to me so that I can then relay them to our panelists. And I just want to start with a really broad question, perhaps, but it is the question that was posed in the title of the colloquium. So before the night ends, I feel that everybody is due an answer to this question. And that is emergency or exaggeration? And obviously, this is not necessarily a one-word simple answer, but, you know, briefly, where on the spectrum of concern would you say that you fall and you feel is an appropriate level of concern about this problem, and a little bit about why? And Kara, we'll start at your end of the table.
That would be only fair if you started at the other end. Yes, I'm not sure, I can't hear if this is working. I think probably from my presentation, you gathered that I think there is reason for concern. I think that we have a problem, real problem with plastic waste. We create these materials, we don't really have a good plan for what to do with them when we're done with them, and as a result, a lot of plastic is ending up in the environment. But I try hard not to panic about the situation. I'm still eating seafood. I'm still wearing synthetic clothing. I try to do my best to reduce the amount of plastics that I use, and I think we can do a lot to help inform this problem. But I don't want people to leave here thinking the sky is falling, because I think we just don't know yet the consequences of all of this plastic in the marine environment or in the environment more generally. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't clean it up. Oh, now it's working.
And the microphone is on. Okay. Chelsea.
Okay. Is my microphone working? Yeah, I think it is. Well, I won't use the word exaggeration or emergency because they're on 2 very deep ends of a spectrum. But I will say that over the years, my work started in the middle of the garbage patch in the South Atlantic Ocean, so one of the garbage patches. And I've slowly come closer and closer to land, working on closer to the source, so where we might be able to actually cut it off. And I've had a lot of samples come into my lab over the years, samples that I thought might have some microplastic in it, but I didn't realize how much. And so doing work in the San Francisco Bay, we had so many particles in samples, I had to have 20 undergraduate students plus some staff and some undergrads working on the samples. Some samples had 1,600 particles in them, 900 particles of which were tire dust. I have fish coming in the lab from the Great Lakes. We find microplastic in every single one, sometimes as high as 700 particles in an individual fish. And someone once said to me, let's sample drinking water. And I said, well, that's ridiculous. It can't be in there. It's got to be treated to the level where it's not there. We turn on the tap, we filtered it, and what did we find? And so I will say that whether it's an emergency or an exaggeration, sure, we might have a lot of science left to do. But the mismanagement of our waste and of the use of these materials has certainly come back to haunt us in ways that we might not necessarily like. And so there's certainly room for action even as we start to answer some of these hard questions.
Thank you. Gunnar, I think you hinted at your answer in your introduction, but emergency or exaggeration?
Oh,
Yes.
okay. The answer is and not or. And I think that currently we do not have enough facts to finally judge about that. Because again, most of these facts are coming from experiments, and you always have to keep in mind that we have ingestion of microplastic, but also egestion. And so what is already known from shellfish and so on, that a lot of the microplastic is egested, and even that was also proven for humans. I think we are currently more or less in between, but we have to be concerned, and we have to be concerned because microplastics is not the only stressor in the environment. I mean, we have multiple stressors in the environment, and even if microplastics is not the evil stressor, the combination of these stressors makes the problem for the ecosystem. So I will not give to total warning, and I also eat fish and so on, because I know that I ingest microplastic. Okay.
I mean, it seems like the answer is it's not just about avoiding seafood, though. Pretty much anything we eat or drink, we're probably likely to find microplastics in. Maybe we can come back to that. But Shige, emergency or exaggeration?
Yeah, I think that the situation is emergency. And to explain it, I like to introduce one study conducted by Dr. Jennifer Lavers, who investigate a species of seabirds in Australia. And she tested the blood chemistry of the seabirds. And she found lower calcium concentrations in blood of seabirds, which ingest more plastics. This means plastic decreases the concentration of calcium. And the senior audience may recall a famous book entitled Silent Spring. The decrease in population of the bald eagle, that is the national bird of your country, and which occurred in 1960s when we utilized too much DDT pesticides. The DDT pesticides disrupted calcium metabolism of birds and caused thinner egg shell, leading to decrease in population of the birds. I think the similar problem may occur with seabirds due to chemicals associated with plastics. Plastic contains additives which disrupt internal systems of biota, and the abnormality in blood chemistry has been detected. So visible effect may be seen if plastic pollution would be more serious. We have to consider the abnormality in the seabirds as canary in coal mine. As precautionary action, we have to reconsider mass consumption of plastics. If you go to the health check and the doctor would say your blood chemistry is blood chemistry is not normal, you have to consider your food to eat more vegetables to reduce the meat. And the seabirds also want to reconsider their food, but their food is already contaminated with plastics. So we have to reduce the amount of plastics in the ocean.
Thank you. And we appreciate the nod to Rachel Carson. There's, of course, a statue across the street and a chair right here with a plaque with her name on it. So, Colin, emergency or exaggeration?
So I think you could tell by my presentation that I don't think we have enough information to say whether or not it's an emergency or an exaggeration. I do hope for the health of my daughter and the environment, though, that it is an exaggeration.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. I agree with Colin and the others. I think that there's so much uncertainty here that it's really hard to pick between the two. If I was forced to pick, I would lean towards exaggeration. But I've been thinking about this question in a slightly different way and thinking about this particular type of pollution in comparison with other things that are happening in the oceans, including the effects of climate change, warming of surface waters, acidification, stratification, that kind of thing, as well as overfishing. Both of those are enormous problems. Does this problem rise to the same level? I'm not sure that it does. But in a way, the exaggeration could be beneficial because it's really, I think Chelsea mentioned this idea of waste literacy, that it's drawing our attention to the ocean. It's making us think about problems that the ocean has. The waste problem or the marine debris or the microplastic problem is really a very tangible problem. And some of these other problems, particularly climate changes in the ocean, are much less tangible. And for the public to understand fully the changes that the ocean is undergoing, it's a much more difficult problem than it is for microplastics. So I would say exaggeration, but exaggeration in a good way.
So one of the themes that we've heard over and over is that we don't have the information we need. And Chelsea, you said you're not a methods person, but you spend a lot of time on methods development. And I'm curious what it is about this problem that makes that so difficult. Why is it so hard to get good, solid, standard numbers around this problem?
Yeah, well, I'd say that it's twofold. So first of all, when I answered that question, I was thinking about microplastics, not plastic in general, right? So it's not hard to count big pieces, right? And I think when we think about seabirds, I completely agree with Shige that the large plastics that are impacting the seabirds, people could say are a state of an emergency. But when it comes to the small stuff, right, this microplastic that's in drinking water and that's in the dust and all of these things, it's really hard to quantify these particles, and it's really hard to characterize and figure out what they are. And the other issue is that there's procedural contamination. As I sit here and fibers fall off my clothing, there's little bits of microplastic dust probably falling in my water. And in our lab, we have to work really hard to keep that dust out of our samples so that we're quantifying what's in the environment and what's not just in the room. So it's this combination of figuring out the right QA/QC and being able to detect the smaller stuff and characterize it and quantify it accurately. And I would probably should turn this question over to the other people sitting next to me who have spent a lot more time in the method development world and do a pretty good job at it.
Yes, please.
Yeah, personally, I think that the analytical approach is not more the bottleneck, because I think there are a lot of techniques out there, and it's possible to provide valid numbers. The problem starts before that, because it's a bit like the great garbage patch. If you think about microplastics, you maybe imagine this microplastics in a petri dish, what I think Kara was it, and displayed it, and you think the microplastic are in the environment laid down in such a way. But the issue is, if you would like to analyze microplastic, you have to enrich a lot of the environment as well. And the problem is the haystack and not the needle, because you have to remove the haystack for analyzing the needle, but not destroying the needle. And this is more or less is a squaring of the circle. And I think this is currently the problem for monitoring issues and so on and so on. It's not more the analytics in my eyes.
Colin, on the front of understanding not only how much is out there, but how long it lasts, as you said, we hear these things like plastic is forever. Why don't we know how long these plastics actually do live in the environment?
There's a lot of reasons. I mean, one, there's just an endless number of combinations of plastics and formulations that you can make. So, we all have these numbers, right? 1 through 7. And when you add additives to it, you create a new type of material. It has different properties, both physical and chemical, and that's going to impact how long it breaks down. Other reasons are in the US, for instance, we're extremely far behind in funding. So the EU and European nations, they have extremely set up networks trying to figure out this problem. And in the US, we're not funding these projects right now. So there's a huge discrepancy with the amount of money available to conduct these experiments and actually figure out how long these materials last in the environment. And the last thing I'll add is education too. So there's this huge discrepancy in my mind where we have a lot of people that know a lot about plastics, so polymer scientists, and a lot of people that know a lot about the environment, so environmental scientists. But we don't have a lot of people that know a lot about both, right? We need to train the next generation of scientists that are experts in both of these disciplines so they can tackle this interdisciplinary problem.
I want to start opening it up to audience questions. So if you have a question, if you could raise your hand and we'll try to get a microphone to you. And while the microphones are making their way, I see a hand here and one over here, to some of these folks, I want to bring up one thing that I know is bound to come up. How many people in the past week or so heard an announcement from a group called Ocean Cleanup that they had a device that they had deployed in the ocean that was successfully collecting plastic, right? This is an announcement that has been years and multiple failed prototypes in the making. And I know there are some strong feelings about this endeavor, but based on how much plastic is in the ocean, and Kara, you showed us those figures for how much has been produced, how much we can account for in the ocean, and some pretty dramatic pictures we've seen tonight of plastic littering beaches and in the ocean. Is it realistic to think that we can clean up what is already out there?
That started.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there is a role for environmental cleanup in this problem, but the place where we should be focusing our efforts on cleaning up is closest to the source. So looking at that photograph of that beach in Peru seems like a pretty good place to start. When we think about the open ocean, I think of that as the end of the pipe. So the plastics that are out there floating that our students are picking out of plankton nets are likely some of the oldest plastics. We don't know how old, very clear. But those are particles that have been breaking down over time. And even though I showed you these beautiful images of high concentrations of microplastics, if you actually compute that spatial distribution, the highest concentrations mean that there's about one or a few pieces of plastic for about 1 square meter of ocean. So just the vast distances you would have to cover to try to actually filter out microplastics is a real challenge. It's far from land, requires a lot of resources. So to try to filter out microplastics from the open ocean, I don't think is the most efficient from the cost chart approach. But I think there are places where cleanup is really important, especially close to land. And if you want to remove microplastics before they get into the environment, let's go to the end of the pipe, the wastewater or stormwater pipe.
I know this is a controversial topic, but I'm seeing a lot of nodding up and down the table. So I think we're going to move on to our first audience question right here in the middle.
Hi, I'm wondering, I know the Japanese found a bacteria, Ideonella, that digests microplastic. Do any of you think that bacteria will evolve into that niche, into the microplastics niche, and perhaps bail us out of this problem?
So, Gunnar, given your background in microbiology and your initial interest in the bacteria that might grow on microplastics, the question being the discovery recently of bacteria that do seem to digest plastic, and there was a lot of media surrounding that, suggesting maybe all we need is big vats of these bacteria to eat up all the plastic, and we've solved the problem. I mean, could bacteria solve this problem? And the question here, in a reasonable time frame, could microbes evolve to fill that niche and actually start eating plastics?
To be precise, in 500 years. No, I mean, the issue is really that these polyolefins are not present on our planet, or were not present before we constructed them, and therefore nature has no idea how to deal with these particular molecules. And there are some plastics which can be degraded, but some really have to be prepared by radiation or radicals in the environment, so that the bacteria can attack the plastics. But again, I don't think that this would be a pretty good solution for the pollution of microplastics. Maybe this is a solution for biotechnology and some very dedicated wastewater treatment plants, whatever, but contained and not in nature. So I don't think that bacteria will evolve and will solve that problem. I think we have to solve the problem.
Okay. We have a question over here.
I guess for Dr. Hoagland, and I think you should feel good about not having known the field but still being here, because I think you hit the nail on the head. Could you give us an idea, your graph of basically the cost of fixing things versus the cost of the problem, and the orders of magnitude of that y-axis compared to some other problems that you've brought up or others? And if we don't have fewer people, do we have any chance of any of this working out?
Yeah, so a precise answer is no. You know, you want to think of that as a framework for thinking about the problem, and it could well be that many of, and I'm glad to see these solution ideas for solutions coming out. You know, I think you could think of these in many cases as testable hypotheses. And maybe they sound like they're crazy to begin with, but we try them out and see if they succeed or fail, and we move on to the next thing. You know, we want to be worried about the scales of the problem and the physical scales, and then start to think about what it's going to cost to approach the problem. Well, could be the case that the costs of some solutions are so high that that optimal policy response is really zero, that we just live with the problem. So I apologize for talking around here, looking for specificity, but I don't think we have that yet.
I want to take a question from our online audience along those lines, directed to you, Colin. How do you think your research on how slowly or quickly plastics break down should affect public policy?
I better answer this well. So, I don't think as scientists it's our job to influence public policy. I think our job is to provide data that then legislators use. And there's, this one finding that polystyrene breaks down faster than we knew before in the presence of sunlight. It's just one factor in the whole big picture that would factor into a new piece of policy. So we need to have a framework where degradation is one component of the risk, right? And that's a risk assessment framework. And eventually, once we have all the information, we can calculate or quantify what that risk is. And then that should inform policy, but we're not there yet.
Got, I think, a question in the back, one down here in the front where I was. Is there a microphone with someone up there? Excellent, go ahead.
Yes. I have a question about, since climate change is affecting the ocean baseline, which impacts the biology, chemistry, and physics that occurs in the ocean, how do you adjust your laboratory studies on microplastic effects to account for the shifting baseline so we have a dynamic system and not a steady state?
Does anybody want to take that one on?
Maybe I can. Can you repeat the question a little bit?
So I think the idea is, given the scale of environmental change in the ocean at this point, how do we take that into account in doing laboratory studies to make sure that they're actually relevant to what's happening in the ocean?
Yeah, so I think, we try to tackle this in a couple ways. One is we do multiple stressor experiments where we change the CO2 and the temperature at the same time as we add a stressor. And we try to make sure that some of our treatments are environmentally relevant. But I think that's one of the reasons why working at the experimental lakes area is so amazing. I know it's not an ocean, but it is a lake that you are able to manipulate. And so you're able to ask this question of what is the fate of the microplastics? What will the impacts be in nature? Because you're actually working in a real lake. And so I think that benefits of some of these types of experimental places where you can manipulate the environment is a way to try to answer some of those questions.
We're losing a few people. I know it's getting late in the evening. I want to just make sure before people walk out that you know that you are all invited to a reception down the street at Redfield. When this ends, we do have a lot of audience interest in asking questions, though. So we're going to go a few more minutes with some of our audience questions. We've got one right here.
Okay. Oh, you can hear me. Great. So based on your research and your readings, because you're all very heavily involved in the microplastics community, is there maybe a group of living organisms that you would say we should be most concerned about? Birds, zooplankton, whales? I don't know if any of you can speak to that.
Shige, would you like to? I mean, you said that you think some fish are the canary in the coal mine. Are there particular species that you think warrant the greatest concern?
For present, our greatest concern is seabird because they ingest so much plastics. But our idea is the similar may happen with the other marine organisms, also to human. And let's consider the fate of additives which are compounded into plastic products. Some are dissolved into water, but some are not dissolved and retained in plastics. And the plastics are degraded to smaller fragments, and they are ingested by biota. And if they contact with the digestive fluid, with some oily component, such the additives can be leached out to the digestive fluid and can be the bioaccumulate in the tissue. Then if it's for the fish, we eat fish, the additives can be exposed to human. So I think our target organism would be the fish or bivalves or seafood.
Were there others, Gunnar, Chelsea, Kara, that wanted to weigh in on perhaps what kind of sea life you might be most concerned about or most you think would be worth focusing in on?
I don't feel like I can answer this question because I worked with Jelena for 2 years. I feel like I should let someone else.
I'm a physical oceanographer.
Plead the fifth. Okay, moving on.
Are any of you aware of any current specific technology that converts plastic into a useful product, say fiber bundles or that type of thing? I mean, any current technology, the technology exists for the conversion of the plastic that's in the environment to a useful product.
Any takers? Gunnar?
I think it's always, currently we see always a downgrading of the product. So you will never see, if a product is packaging, it will never go packaging because of hygiene and so on. And so it's always downgraded, and this is even worse for the environment. I mean, you see these sometimes fancy products where we make some things from collected plastics, and this is sold as a bioproduct or whatever. But I don't think this should not be the final goal for that. I mean, when it's in the environment, it's already weathered and so on. It's not anymore the plastics which we would like to have the valuable product, and it's always a downgrade.
That says
Okay.
recycling doesn't exist.
Okay, so we're running short. What did you want?
I just want to add one, and I'm sort of speaking out of turn here, but speaking with Hauke before he left, he did mention that there is interest in using plastics as a kind of a fuel, and that wouldn't be plastics that's already in the environment necessarily, but it would be taking plastics out of the waste recycling stream and using it as a fuel. Of course, there are issues with that too, in terms of the release of carbon dioxide and so forth. So,
We're going to take two last questions. There's one person in the back who's been waiting since the very beginning, and then we have a young questioner here, and then we'll wrap things up for the evening.
Hi, thank you. My question refers back to a point that Dr. Gertz, is that it? Gertz made with regard to young microplastics in terms of not letting them get into the waterways in the first place. I'm willing to do my part. I don't use straws. I recycle. I'm washing a lot more dishes. But what's being done at a bigger level? Like, I think we've all heard stories about cruise ships and military vessels just dumping their trash into the oceans and countries using the waterways as a trash receptacle. Are there laws or things going on to prevent that from continuing?
Gunnar, you mentioned political will, but I don't know if that's a question you want to take on in terms of, is there action being taken to address policy action on a broad scale to address plastics entering the ocean? Porter, maybe that's something more in your realm.
I can take it if you want.
Yeah,
I mean, there's a lot going on a broad scale. Right. So in terms of dumping at sea, the International Maritime Organization has MARPOL Annex 5, which says it is illegal to dump your plastics at sea anywhere in the world. Now, it's hard to regulate things in the middle of the ocean. On a global level, the United Nations right now has altered or made changes to the Basel Convention, which says that we now have to be more mindful about how we trade waste around the world, and you actually have to have countries agree that they will take it, and so that it's more tractable. And then there's a conversation about an international agreement, and Norway's pushing hard for something that looks similar to Paris, that says you have to reduce your emissions by a certain amount, and there's many different ways you can get there, be it recycling, be it improved waste management systems, be it reductions in plastic. So there's a lot going on right now at all levels of government. And so there are things to be hopeful for.
Thank you for that. All right, our last question from the audience tonight.
So I've been working on a project relating to microplastics for a couple of years now, and it's become clear to me that as these microplastics break down and as their cumulative surface area increases in relation to the volume, then they're binding with things such as biologicals or even toxins such as mercury. So my question is, does this mean that these microplastics are becoming more toxic at a quicker rate?
I think your fellow panelists have said this one's yours.
So your question is the microplastics in the environment is much more toxic than the original one?
I think the question is, are they becoming more toxic as they are in the environment?
Yes, because they accumulate the hydrophobic or lipophilic, the pollutants from the environment. But originally they contain the toxic compounds as additives. Some of them are still retained in the microplastics. But due to their smaller size, that means the larger surface specific area, so they can be leached out easily if they contact with some digestive fluid in the organisms. And also the digestive fluid should contain the oily components. If you eat something with microplastic, and if you eat something oily stuff, the toxic additive may be leached out and accumulate in your body.
I want to ask each of our panelists one last question before we go tonight. And given that we do have so many young people in the audience, could you each suggest an individual action that you think is appropriate to the scale of the problem? We won't call it an emergency because we don't have agreement that that's what it is. But an individual action that you think is appropriate to the problem, and in particular to young people, a step that they might take. And we'll start this time and we'll work our way that way.
Well, I did do a little bit of homework. In thinking about this question, which Heather mentioned to us earlier today. And, I think we now have a Massachusetts legislator who's running for president. And at least within the last 3 years, if you live in Massachusetts, we haven't been able to write our congressmen, our senators, because there's nothing they can do. Here's an opportunity to write Elizabeth Warren and tell her about this problem. And so the research that I did was to look and see if any of the presidential candidates have started thinking or talking about plastics pollution. And it did come up recently in the climate forum that was held in early September, but it kind of in a strange way. Really was about climate. And Elizabeth Warren brought it up, and she said that, particularly with respect to plastic straws, that this was a kind of thing that the oil companies were throwing out to distract people. That wasn't the real problem, but they're trying to distract people. And I'm not sure she's got it right. And so I think for the young people here to write a letter to your senator who might become president, that would be effective.
All right, Colin.
So I sort of already gave away my advice, but my advice is to get educated. So if a curriculum, when you go to college and you want to study this, let's say, and you want to solve this problem or work towards a solution, try to build your own curriculum that allows you to study polymer sciences and environmental sciences simultaneously. At the time that I was majoring in environmental chemistry, this was not an option. But nowadays, there's a lot of flexibility with curriculum, so you can tailor your education to target this specific problem.
So my suggestion to the young people is to reduce the consumption of the single-use plastics. Single-use plastics is a source of the marine plastic pollution, also the marine microplastics. Also, if you use so much the single-use plastics, it can increase the burden of the toxic chemicals to yourself. Also, it may increase the risk of the global warming.
I totally agree with the consumption argument, but if you want to change something, you can also start by yourself. You can start to think when you use plastics. I mean, what I know is that the mean usage time for a plastic bag is 15 minutes. So you use the plastic bag for carrying something, and after 15 minutes, it's not more used for carrying, but just it's for you, it's garbage. You forget about that, even if you can reuse the plastic bag. So what I mean is the solution is to think about the whole throwaway thing and to reuse these issues, because personally, I think that plastic is not evil. It's a valuable material, but you should give a value to the material by yourself.
I would say things that I think some of it I'm echoing from other people, but I would say to become waste literate, and that includes maybe going and visiting a wastewater treatment plant or a landfill or a recycling center in your area. But I would do it in such a way that you understand what can actually be thrown away and disposed of in different ways in your city. So a lot of people don't know what you can put in your own blue bin, what you can put in your green bin if you have one, or what goes in your black bin. And then do an experiment. Spend a week trying to buy only things that can feed into a circular economy so that can be recycled or go into a green bin. And then note down how hard that is. And then send that letter to Elizabeth Warren or to whoever your local representative is and ask for it to become easier on them or on yourself.
I think I would say really even beyond plastic pollution, for young people to become engaged in your local community. And whether that means your household or your school or your town, figure out what you're passionate about and tell people about it and learn about it, echoing everything that everybody just said here. I think the reason that I've been doing this as long as I have is I just love the energy and the passion of the young people who are concerned about this, and the older people who go around and build water stations in a town that they just moved to, or start litter reduction teams, or ask restaurants to stop using straws. But it's the passion of the people in the local community that make the change that you want to see in the place that you live.
So reduce, reuse, recycle, take charge of your own learning, be an engaged citizen. I think that's good advice not only for the plastic problem, but for life in general. And with that, we invite you all to, again, the reception. If you leave this building and walk down Water Street, across the bridge, the brick building on your left is Redfield, and that's where the reception will be. Thank you all so much for coming tonight, and thank you again to our fabulous panelists.